This is the Build Wealth Canada podcast, episode number 57.
Welcome to the Build Wealth Canada podcast, where it's all about becoming debt-free, accelerating your wealth, and taking control of your money. Now, here's your host, Cornell Schreiber.
Hello and welcome to the show. Today we have Kristy and Bryce, who are Canada's youngest retirees. Kristy retired at 31 while Bryce was 32. And today I picked their brains on how they pulled it off, how they invest, and how they structured their investment portfolio to ensure that they never run out of money. Now, I'm a huge fan of these guys. Kristy has actually been my rock in helping me pull the trigger on her own early retirement, so I'm eternally grateful for that, as it is pretty scary leaving a steady paycheck in your 30s with 2 kids to support. So, Kristy, if you do listen to this episode, thank you for that. You've been really helpful and have definitely decreased the nervousness when it comes to all that. Now, Kristy and Bryce have also just launched a new book on how to retire early, and in it, they share a repeatable step-by-step plan on how anybody can retire early. It's a very practical book. I really enjoyed it, and I wish it was around when I started my FIRE journey. And in case this is your first time hearing that term, FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early, and it's actually becoming a pretty big movement worldwide at the moment. So their book is called Quit Like a Millionaire, and I have some copies to give away to you as well. So if you do want to sign up for free to be entered into the draw, just go to buildwealthcanada.ca/giveaway, all one word. So that's buildwealthcanada.ca/giveaway. So you can just enter your email there and you will automatically be entered into the draw. All right. Now, this is a pretty in-depth interview, so I really think you'll like it. But before we dive in, I want to let you know about a new free guide that I published on the top ETFs in Canada for 2019. It's something that's been repeatedly requested by listeners of the show. And just an FYI that if you're listening to this episode years from now and it's not 2019 anymore, then just know that I'll be updating this guide annually. So you can always get the top ETFs for Canadians, no matter when you're listening to this particular episode. Now, in the guide, I go over what I personally invest in, why I invest in it, and the investments that I talk about are literally where we have almost our entire net worth. It is what we are primarily living off right now in our early retirement. So I figure at the very least, you'll learn about some great ETFs to consider for your own portfolio. And if you are new to ETFs, then I'll give you a nice list of some top ETFs to consider from the thousands that are out there. I know it can be pretty overwhelming for people just getting into this, because how do you know which one to pick? And so at least this way, you have a nice sort of base starting point of ETFs to consider. All right. So I'm making this guide available for free to any listeners that use my special link to sign up for a free savings account with my favorite bank and the bank that I use, which is EQ Bank. And for long-term listeners, if you've already signed up to EQ Bank through my link in the past, then just send me an email and I'll send the guide over to you. Now, the reason that I personally use EQ Bank is that they have one of the highest interest rates in Canada. So in all the years I've been with them, I haven't been able to find a higher interest rate anywhere. Plus, it's free to sign up and keep an account with them. So you're not paying a monthly fee like you do with many of the other banks out there in Canada. And you also get unlimited free Interac e-transfers as a bonus, which is super convenient whenever you need to send somebody money. So because of those reasons, I've been with them ever since they launched in Canada many years ago. And it's where I actually keep my entire emergency fund and my spending money as well. So basically, just about everything of mine that isn't being invested in ETFs goes directly into my EQ Bank account to earn me the high interest while, the money is insured, it's secure there, it's totally safe. So I always have that available, but I'm at the same time also earning some nice interest. And just to put things in perspective, when I recorded this, their Savings Plus account automatically gives you 2.3% interest. And that's an ongoing rate, not some temporary promotion that you see some of the other banks do. And while many of the banks in Canada are actually offering 1% or less. So in other words, by using the bank that I use, you could actually double the interest that you're getting from your checking and savings accounts for free. Plus you're getting those unlimited Interac e-transfers. And this is why I've been using and recommending them for years to anybody that's asked. And then eventually, after recommending them for so long, I approached them and asked them if they want to sponsor the show. So because I'm kind of recommending them anyway. So to get the free high interest account and the free guide on the top ETFs in Canada, just go to buildwealthcanada.ca/EQ. That's buildwealthcanada.ca/ the letter E and the letter Q. Open the free account, and once you're done, forward any email that you get from EQ to bonus@buildwealthcanada.ca, and I'll send you the full comprehensive guide for free. So that link again is buildwealthcanada.ca/ bonus.ca/EQ to open an account, and then forward me any email that you get from EQ to bonus@buildwealthcanada.ca, and I'll email you the free in-depth guide. All right, so enjoy. Thank you for supporting the show in that way and for using that link. And now let's get into the episode. All right, Kristy, Bryce, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having us.
Hi there.
Well, really excited to have you guys on. To kick things off, can you guys tell us your story and how you were able to retire in your early 30s?
Sure. Okay. So we're Kristy and Bryce. And so we used to live in Toronto, which, as everyone knows, it's one of the most expensive cities to live in Canada. So we were both working as computer engineers and doing what everyone else was doing, including our peers. So what we were trying to do was save up enough money to buy a house and do, what the normal thing, which is work until you're 65, retire with a pension, and just be normal. Go down the straight and normal path. What happened in 2010 after we got married is that we started going around at open houses and looking for a place to buy. And what we found was that as soon as we walked in the door for a lot of those open houses, you could see the real estate agent kind of sizing us up. And, she's kind of saying like, are you sure you can afford this place? Like, look at you guys. So, at that point I was like, okay, this is, this market's definitely a seller's market. Let's continue looking and see what happens. And then the bidding war started. Before you even, put in your bid, the house is already sold. And then I started noticing that dilapidated houses in our neighborhood were being snatched up by developers for $400,000. And I'm talking about dilapidated, like they're, things are falling apart. It's scary. There's like holes in the backyard for some reason. There's like, signs talking about UFOs on the windows or something. So that house ain't not right. And then that house, gets picked up for $400,000 and then gets, some developer comes over, slaps on some paint, does like half-ass job. And then a month later, it gets flipped and sold for $800,000.
Yeah, we knew that house was a crap hole.
Yeah.
And that the person who won, quote unquote, won that bidding war just signed up for a world of hurt. Uh-huh. This was the housing market in Toronto in 2010. I'm not sure what it is now in 2019. But it was just this predatory Ponzi scheme. And at that point, we were just kind of like, you know what? We don't want to play.
Yep. I don't want to be part of this. So I really started to question whether it makes sense to put all of our life savings into a house. And then down the road, there was this moment that was basically like my aha moment that woke me up from this normal path of buying a house and working until you're 65, is when I saw one of my coworkers collapse and almost die at his desk from overwork and stress. And he actually had to be rushed off to the hospital. And the doctor said that if he had been rushed off just half an hour or an hour later, he would have been dead. So then at that point, I started looking around. There was more and more layoffs. There was more and more instability at my job. And then I started to realize, you know what, thinking that a job is going to take care of you until you're 65, that path no longer works. I mean, the advice that we've been given by our parents and the tried and true path of buy a house, work until you're 65, that might have worked back in the 80s, but it no longer works. Like, our jobs don't exist until 65. We can't just wait for a pension, and houses are not extremely affordable like it was for our parents. So at this point, it kind of clued in on me that's like, you know what, the traditional advice that our parents gave us, they mean well, but for this generation, it just doesn't work anymore. Like, we have to make changes. It's just, there's so many people that are stressed out. People are almost dying at their desks. People are going crazy, buying houses and just throwing good money after bad with these properties. And it just didn't make any sense to me. So then at this point, we decided, okay, what can we possibly do? So around 2012, when we were going to buy a house and we had saved up $500,000, just really, really trying desperately to buy a house, saving as much as possible. We realized at that point, what if we actually invest the money and then continue saving towards a portfolio instead? That was around the time that we discovered index investing, and we also discovered the financial independence movement. Like, we started reading blogs, we started consuming as many books as we could on investing, and it was around that point that we discovered the 4% rule, and we calculated that we would need $1 million to passively generate enough income to cover our $40,000 a year expense. And that would be the point that we could retire. And so I thought that it was going to take maybe another 5 or 10 years, because this was around 2012. It ended up only taking us 3 years. And then we were able to retire at the age of 31 in 2015. So basically the rest is history. And we've been traveling the world since, and we've been retired about 4 years now. And it just blows my mind. Like every day I get up and I just cannot believe that this is my life. I just think I'm dreaming every single day. It's been incredible.
That's awesome. And I appreciate you guys blogging a lot about it too. I know you guys go into so much detail, more than most from what I've seen. And it's just, it's really, I know, you and I had some emails back and forth before this. And like I said, in those emails, you guys have really trailblazed the path for Canadians, I feel, because you're doing it. So you're a real life case study. It's not like some theory you've read somewhere and you're thinking, hopefully this works. You're actually doing it and you're documenting it. And you're being very transparent with how you do everything. And so that's really, really awesome, because then someone like myself, who kind of retired right after you guys, can then look at that and say, okay, this is great, at least at the very least, a great starting point. And then now I can maybe adjust it to my situation to make it work for me. Like, for example, we have kids, right? So then it's like, okay, how do I modify things to take care of things from that angle, right? Things of that nature. So it's really, really awesome to have that kind of strong foundation thanks to you guys, instead of having to feel like you're in isolation trying to figure this all from scratch, and then like, hopefully it works out. And
awesome. Welcome aboard the FI train.
It is
congrats.
It is subtly different for Canadians in that our taxation structure is different from the Americans. I would say that our taxation structure, our incomes tend to be lower, but our taxation structure is a lot simpler, so it's a lot easier to understand. With the American system, it's so easy for them to get lost and accidentally do the wrong thing and screw themselves over in terms of like setting up tax shelters and 401ks for decades without realizing that they're doing the wrong thing. So in some ways, our system is actually easier to use. But I think what's most interesting is when we talk about housing with a lot of Americans and a lot of the media and this kind of stuff. When we say houses aren't the best investment, Americans kind of go, well, yeah, I know that, because they went through the housing crash and they know people that have lost everything. In Canada, we are still crazy about housing. So the idea here that a house is not a good investment is still considered heresy, and it weirds people out because they're like, how could you not want a house? In Canada, we haven't learned the lesson that the Americans very painfully learned almost 10 years ago. And that's the part that really weirds me out, because, we saw what it did to them, and yet we're still making the exact same mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think part of that, I think too, is just coming from, that's the way it has been. People are raised, they see their parents, their friends telling them that that's what they should be doing. And so that sort of seems to be the default path, right? Because you trust your parents, you trust your parents' friends. And I don't know what Kristy, you were talking about how, how you had, I think you said your parents were sort of, pushing you in a different direction, right? And I kind of learned this lesson early on as well, was that, just because someone wants what's best for you and has the best intentions for you, that doesn't mean everything that they recommend to you is the correct answer.
Oh, absolutely. Totally. Yeah. And that's why we see, absolutely. And that's why we say, their intentions are good. Our parents giving us advice, they have our best interests at heart. 100%. But again, that advice is, tuned to 1980s, and they need to tune a brand new channel. It's broken. It doesn't work anymore for this particular situation because everything has changed.
I was when I was doing research, when we first started the blog, I looked at back in like the 1970s, and the ratio in Canada of, I think, the average housing price to the average salary was about like 2 to 3x. So people would get into debt, but they would try to get out of it as quickly as possible because interest rates were like, 15, 20% or something crazy like that. But because the house itself wasn't that expensive, it wouldn't take them that long. So that'd be equivalent of, an engineer making $60,000 and then buying a house for $150,000. Like, yeah, that doesn't exist anymore. Now the ratio was something like 17x or something like that. Like people are willingly signing themselves up to 25, 30-year mortgages and just intending to just stay in that mortgage forever. So if you're going to be in that situation, your job better be damn solid. And the thing is, our jobs are not. So
Right.
like, it's like, that's the big disconnect. My dad will kind of say, well, you have a house, houses always go up because they went up for him.
Yeah.
They went up for him because he bought right when interest rates were at 15%, and the interest rates have done nothing but fall to 2 until recently, where it started to tick back up again. So he hasn't lived in an environment where houses have ever gone down in value. So of course that would make sense for him. That's not our situation.
For sure, 100%. And yeah, I didn't live in Toronto, so I never got to experience the craziness that you guys did. But I remember around that time, not that long ago, we were experiencing a bit of that here in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I live. And I remember, I would see these bidding wars that are just happening constantly, and it just seemed crazy to me. I mean, it's like the writing's on the wall that this is not a sustainable thing. And I remember, after seeing enough of that, at that time we owned a larger house, and we were mortgage free on the house, and then we had a rental property too. And when I saw the craziness happening there, I was like, you know what, I'm cashing out. This is it. It was there's clearly, the gains have happened, they're there. We can't. I felt like it would be foolish to assume that the growth we've experienced is going to continue growing at that pace, because it's just not realistic. Right. Incomes aren't increasing at the rate the houses are, right? And so I remember we sold our rental, threw it all into index ETFs, and then with our primary residence, we actually downgraded. So we ended up selling our house, and then moving into a smaller house as well. So I mean, that was something that actually helped us reach our FI number. But yeah, so just to speak to the craziness you guys saw, we got a bit of that too. And
good for you. Yeah. I think what happens with housing is it's such an emotional decision, right? Like when I talk to other people about our asset allocation for our investments, we're doing 60-40, somebody else might be more, bullish and they're doing 90-10. They're a lot less risk adverse. We don't fight about that. We're just okay, agree to disagree. That totally makes sense for you. This totally makes sense for me. But when you start bringing up housing, people get so emotional, because it's if you don't buy into it and you're nah, no thanks, I don't really want that, then that affects the value of their house, because they start worrying that not enough people are getting into the market. And some people are so over leveraged that the house doesn't even have to go up. It can just stay flat. The house price can just stay flat, and they would be in big trouble because they have this domino effect of buying property one after another, right? Mm-hmm. So it really is this emotional just baggage. And I see people whose houses have gone up in Toronto, it's doubled, and they're still miserable because they refuse to sell it. And when I ask them why, they say, well, then I'm going to have to just buy another house. So why would I do that? So it's once they become homeowners, it's they couldn't possibly believe going back to renting or downsizing. They're I'm used to this lifestyle. I cannot change it. This is who I am. I'm so emotionally attached to this house, right? So I think that's where the fear of missing out and that whole other people are trying to get you into the market, because it's really emotional.
Yeah, but that's what we call them home boners on our site. And I don't
that doesn't mean everybody who buys a house. That means people who are obsessed with real estate, and who say anything else, you're a heretic.
I don't think Remax is getting us any advertising dollars anytime soon.
That's right. No affiliate deals with Remax.
Don't want it.
Nope.
So you guys mentioned your book a few times. Tell us a bit about your book. What's it about? Who's it for? And how do us Canadians benefit from reading it?
Sure. The book is actually an interesting story, because initially we didn't actually want to write a book. So I got this email one day from an editor from Penguin, and she said, "Oh, I have a client who is a Hollywood actress, and she reads your blog, and she recommended you guys to me. So I started reading your blog, and I think it would be really great for you to write a book." And our actual reaction, because we had written children's books before, so we've been in the industry, right? And I was like, "Oh, I don't want to write a book. It's so much work." And then we actually had several calls with the editor. She's actually an editor from Penguin. And then after a while, I got to talking with her, and then she convinced us that it's actually a good idea to write a book. So what ended up coming out of that discussion was, so the book is actually about the lessons that I learned through growing up in poverty and then moving into middle class and then finally becoming rich. So it's basically the lessons learned from going from the bottom 1% to the top 1%, because we believe that in order to understand finances and actually like achieve financial freedom, you need lessons from different classes. Like you need lessons from growing up in poverty, and you need lessons from people who know how to make money with money, right? So this book is basically like, we try to write it in a way that's story based so that people who don't usually read finance books will be able to understand, what is an ETF and how do you invest, and those topics that are seemingly complicated in the most simplest way possible.
And what we think is most special about this book is that when she said she grew up in poverty, she grew up in abject poverty, the way that most Canadians could never understand. She actually was born in China and then immigrated into Canada when she was 7. And when she was in China, we did the research back then to see what their family made and lived on back then in rural China, and it was like 44 cents, the equivalent of 44 cents a day. That's what they were living on. And the opening of the book starts with her a true story of her rummaging through a medical waste heap looking for toys. That was her reality growing up. And then to go from that all the way to clawing her way into the middle class when actually immigrating to Canada and then becoming a millionaire. What was the most interesting thing about that story is there was almost no real like random events or luck involved. There are stories of people that, there's a rags to riches stories of people that managed to hit a home run because they made the next Snapchat or they bought Apple when it was like $10. There's precisely none of those events that happened throughout her life. And as a result of that, her journey is completely reproducible. So depending on where the reader is in their socioeconomic status when they're started, they should be able to find out where they kind of match up to where she is, where her journey was, and then simply start copying the moves that she made going forward. And if they do that, they're going to become a millionaire in about the same amount of time, because everything that we did in the book and to get here was mathematically reproducible. And that's really special because most finance books don't have that journey that you can literally just copy and paste and then you'll get the same result.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Yeah, the fact that you guys have it as a repeatable process that people can follow instead of going out there searching on your own, trying to put the pieces together, trying to figure out which advice works, which one is just someone just telling it to you because they're making money off you on the back end, something like that, right? So, so that's fantastic because it can be very overwhelming. I mean, all the information's available now, but it's so hard it can be hard to piece it all together and separate what's true.
That was our experience. Yeah, that was absolutely our experience too. The reason why I wrote this book was there was no how. The reason why I wrote this book as kind of like a how to become a millionaire book kind of thing, like this a single reproducible path, because we couldn't find one that was like that. In the book, she's like pulling advice from my master's class on financial engineering and modern portfolio theory and how to evaluate bonds and like different books from different sources, the retirement planning, and trying to figure out how to put all this advice together into an actionable, like something like, what do I do? And all that hard work that we did paid off amazingly well. And then now we're just kind of like, you know what? Just copy our work, because if somebody else follows the same path, it doesn't take anything away from us. It's not a zero-sum game. It worked for us. It'll work for you. It's just math.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I mean, and it's life-changing too, right? I mean, I think if someone, I think I'm very gung-ho on the whole FIRE movement, because I think once you hit that number and you're able, where you don't have to work for money anymore, you can now really pursue what you're passionate about, what you love. And at least I'll ask you the question about this later, but I mean, I found personally that you can't just sit back and not work at all. You want something for the fulfillment, you want to give back, there is that need we have as humans, right? And so
the first 6 months is good to sit back and do nothing. That you deserve that, you earned it,
But then after that, absolutely.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
I find that one of the benefits of becoming financially independent is that it helps you think of like the bigger questions. Because when we were working, it was just, like pay off the bills and just, you can't really think about anything. You're just treading water and you're thinking about yourself a lot. Once you actually become financially independent, you actually have that breathing space, not just to find your own passions, but like you said, to give back. Like we actually had time to volunteer. We had time to build an app for a nonprofit. Like I've had time to like actually mentor other girls on how to program and like make an app. So these are all things that we would have never had time to think about or had time to do while we were working. So you kind of like, it's like that triangle of needs, right? Like once you have your needs fulfilled, you're at the top of the pyramid. It's like, how can I give back? Like, what is the purpose of life? How do I find meaning? How can I build a community? How can I help other people? Mm-hmm. And that has been the most rewarding thing about financial independence, and like an advantage, a benefit that people don't think about until after they retire.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I mean, if you help someone hit their fire, get to that level, and now they have the mental freedom and time freedom to pursue something they're passionate about, they're going to do better at it. They now could go and turn that around and give back in their own way with whatever their skills and interests are. Absolutely. Right. So I think it's almost like with this book, I feel almost like you guys there's a bit of like a snowball effect, right? Where you teach someone, they do it, and now they can help others, and then those can help others, and those, and it just kind of, it can be an exponential sort of, benefit, right, to people. So I think it's fantastic you guys did the book in that kind of a way where it is a, step-by-step repeatable process, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've actually seen like results already just because we do a lot of reader cases on our blog. We've had people actually respond to us and say, oh my God, I was so lost. I didn't know what to do with my finances. And then after you did my reader case, I really had to go back and look at it. And then you find out that their like savings rate went from, like negative 5%, and all of a sudden they're saving like 30%, and they're going to work towards 50% of their savings rate. And then other people have actually like sold everything and then started traveling the world. And like one of them, because one of them is like remotely working there, it doesn't actually make any difference where they are. And then they managed to like cut their budget in half. And then now they actually have extra time to volunteer at the animal shelter and things that they never would have had time to do before, right? So we've actually seen real life cases, the concrete cases of people who have actually changed their lives because they're no longer stressing about money. Mm-hmm. They can actually think about like, how to build a community, their family, giving back and things like that.
Yeah. Again, because the stuff that we did actually works. You can it's reproducible. And that's what's the most amazing part about this journey.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. And then what analysis did you guys do to determine if you have enough to retire, and then also ensure that you don't run out of money? What was the whole sort of thought process you went through there?
Well, so it was based primarily off of a body of work by a professor named Wade Pfau at a college called Trinity College, I believe, in which he was a economist or something, and he was trying to determine what was a safe amount a retiree could withdraw from their portfolio and not run out of money. And what he did was he ran what's called a Monte Carlo analysis. So he would, using software, he would simulate, hundreds and hundreds of retirees that were retiring across all of the history of the stock market, and seeing, and then having them withdraw different amounts, simulated, and then seeing which one of them made it and which one of them did it. And from this, he was able to determine that what is the now famous 4% rule that a lot of retirement planners use. And what the 4% rule states is that a retiree retiring with a portfolio of a certain size can afford to withdraw a starting amount of 4% of that portfolio and then adjust their withdrawal to inflation every year. And if they do that, then they stand a 95% chance of not running out of money over a 30-year retirement period. So that formed the basis of what is a safe amount to withdraw or the safe withdrawal rate. So, which is 4%. So from that, you can kind of reverse engineer and say, okay, if you can withdraw 4% of your portfolio every year without running out of money in order to retire, that means that the inverse of 4% is 25. That means that if you take your current living expense and you multiply that by 25, that's how much money you need to save in order to passively maintain your current living expenses in retirement. So that's kind of where we started off. We were in Toronto, and we knew that we were spending about $40,000 a year. And from that, we figured, okay, we needed $1 million to retire. At the time we were looking at housing, we had been saving up to get that down payment for that damn house. And at the time, we had saved up $500,000, and we were ready to blow it on a house. And when we hit that aha moment of being like, I don't want to do that. So we took that money and then we figured, okay, if we invested and then we start making a kind of like a conservative estimate of 6% ROI in passive index investing, how long would it take for us to, hit $1 million if we continue saving at the rate that we did, give or take? And the answer that came out was 3 years. So then the decision point became, okay, do I want to give a bunch of money to this homeowner and then be in debt for the next 25 years, or do I want to retire in 3 years? And then the answer was pretty obvious from that. I was like, oh, screw the house. I'm going to retire and sit on the beach. So that's kind of the basic rule that we use to determine how much we needed to retire came from, the 4% rule.
Gotcha. And then with the Trinity study, they looked at 30 years, whereas because you guys are early retired, your time range is more like 60 years in retirement. So did you adjust the 4% rule to something like 3.5%, for example? Or how did you deal with that, I guess, limitation of the Trinity study where they're looking at a 30-year time frame? Because traditionally that's when people would retire, right? As they would say, okay, at 60 you retire, that date sets you up until you're 90, so you're set. How did you guys factor all that in?
Sure. So what we did with that was after we left, we started traveling, and when we started traveling that it was possible to actually adjust how much money that you spent based on where you stayed in. So, for example, if you then, to our surprise, because we all think that traveling is expensive, when you're living in a place like the UK, obviously your expenses are very high. But if you're living in a place like Thailand, which is where we're talking to you right now, your expenses are very low. And when you're living in Thailand, our expenses actually dropped from $40,000 to a year, if we were to stay here for the entire year, to about $25,000. So we realized that there was a way that you could control how much money that you actually spent based on where you were living. So what we realized from that was that, first of all, even though you could save up that much in order to spend $40,000, you could choose to spend far less simply by choosing to live on a beach in Thailand, like what we're doing now. And second, we talk about this a bit in the book, and we realized that we could adapt the 4% rule to which again, as you've pointed out, is for a 30-year retirement period to an arbitrary amount of retirement period by simply rerunning the simulation every year. So every year, when you put your number, at the moment that you retire, you put your numbers in, the calculators will tell you 4% as the success rate of what you're planning to spend. The next year after that, if you say, okay, now I have this amount of money, I'm going to rerun the calculation and plug my numbers into the calculator, and then show what's my success rate now. And but this calculation is actually going to show your retirement for an additional 30 years, like restarting now. So by doing this every year, you can actually measure the overall health of your retirement over time. And this works perpetually, because every time you do that, you're resetting your retirement for the next 30 years. So by doing that, you can figure out, okay, if my portfolio my retirement is getting a little less healthy because it went from my withdrawal rate my safety factor went from 95% success rate to like 94. Maybe I'll spend a little bit more time in Vietnam next year, and then spend less, and then let's see what that does to my retirement. And then you put that number in, and you say, oh, actually that makes it go up to 98. So you can do this to continuously adjust how much you spend each year by adjusting where you travel and where you retire in. And that way you can adapt the study to basically work for a retirement period of infinite years, because each year you're retesting and recreating a retirement of 30 years, starting now. So this is a process we call perpetual re-retirement, and it's a concept that we talk about in the book.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. Yeah. And then how do you deal with something, for example, recently, right at the end of 2018, we had a bit of a correction, right, in the markets. Nothing crazy like a 2008, but there was clearly a correction, right? So in those cases, January comes around. Now at that point, are you now rerunning your simulations again using the Monte Carlo analysis? And we'll get to the tools later for anyone listening, because we'll talk about those, because these are free tools you can use. So that's like a whole other question later. But do you guys just rerun those simulations then in January and say, oh dear, our net worth just dropped by a fairly significant amount? What's your thought process in those kinds of situations?
Yep, that's essentially what we did. And on top of that, we added another kind of layer to our own retirement strategy, which we call the yield shield. Which I know you want to talk about that a little bit later. But that's a strategy that we also use to prevent ourselves from actually needing to withdraw from the portfolio during a down year, and that's the dangerous thing to do. When the 5% of people that fail in those simulations fall victim to something called a sequence of return risk. And the sequence of return risk is what happens when you retire and then immediately hit a series of down years. Because if you retire and then the stock markets go up, 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 and then down a little bit, that's okay because you're still above your original number. But if you retire and then it goes down, down, and then like up, 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 that's actually really bad because during that initial down year, you were forced to sell when your portfolio was smaller. And as a result, when the stock market rebounds, as it inevitably does, you had less units in order to participate in the upside. So the danger of failing comes from being forced to sell stock units or portfolio units in a downturn. So what you want to do is you want to prevent yourself from doing that, and to do that, we built this additional layer on top of our portfolio called the yield shield. So I guess you want to talk about that a bit.
For sure. Yeah, that's one of the future questions for sure. But before we get into that one, I mean, you guys have been retired already now for several years. How have your thoughts on the 4% rule changed, if at all, in any way? Now that you've kind of because before retirement, right? It's theoretical, right? And I mean,
right.
it's based on actual market data, right? So it's not like it's coming out of nowhere. But now that you've actually lived it, and then obviously 4% rule has certain assumptions as well, right? And now you got to kind of live through those in real life. Have your views on it changed at all? What are your thoughts on that?
So as we were retiring, we were actually quite cognizant of the fact that we could be retiring into a market correction because there had been a bull run for so long, right? So we knew that we had to mitigate for the first 5 years. So that's like, let's test it out. We're test dummies for this, for sequence of return risk. What do we do? So that's when we came up, before we even left work, we came up with this 3-prong strategy, and we didn't even know about the third prong, how well it was going to work at the time, but it's really working now. So the first prong is having enough yield, like Bryce was saying. We'll get into that later, like what you do to actually build this yield shield. But basically, if you have fixed income and dividends coming in and you don't actually have to sell any of your actual underlying ETFs, that shields you from having to sell anything and risk like depleting your portfolio too fast. So that's yield shield is the first prong. The second prong, we also have a cash cushion that we saved up that actually allows us to cover living expenses for 3 years. So that's the second prong. And then the third prong is geographic arbitrage. So as engineers, we like to not just have one backup plan, but have multiple backup plans. And that's kind of like how airplanes work, right? Like when you actually run into a problem, they don't just have one way of solving the problem. They have many, many backup plans where you fall from one level to the next, and then it catches you on the next level of backup plan, right? So right before we retired, we knew that we could be running into sequence of return risk. So we were very cognizant in building these 3-prong approach to help us get through it. And we've actually had to test them. So first in 2015, I don't think Americans really had to go through this, but for Canadians, there was, because the oil prices were going down, there was an oil crash. So as a result, our portfolio plummeted. So we actually managed to use the yield shield along with the cash cushion to be able to not have to sell any of the assets. So that basically shows you that because you have this 3-pronged strategy, that we've actually used it and survived as a result and haven't depleted our portfolio. So as a result, our portfolio now is actually much higher than when we started.
Yeah. So I mean, it's now we've had 2 negative years out of the previous 4, oddly enough. So 2015, there was a Saudi oil crisis that hit Alberta particularly hard, and as a result of the TSX particularly hard, as well as this most recent market correction that happened in December of 2018. And in both cases, what we did was we chose not to sell anything, as the 4% rule would tell us to do at a loss. We used up a year of our cash cushion, and then the next year, when everything rebounded, we refilled the cash cushion back up again. So by doing this, as Kristy said, we were able to avoid doing the bad thing and wind up one of those 5% for guys that ran their portfolio into the ground. And as of right now, I think we retired with 1 million, and now we're looking at
our net worth is 1.2 million now.
Yeah, 1.2 now.
So we break down all the statistics and all the numbers in our book as well as on our blog.
So we survived 2 crashes. We're now richer than when we retired. So to answer your original question, we're a lot more confident in 4% rule than than we were. But that's because we didn't blindly rely on the 4% rule. We took the 4% rule as a guideline for how much to save, but then we kind of, used our engineering brains to kind of create all these like fail-safe mechanisms so that we really wouldn't be vulnerable for if the bad things that did happen.
That's awesome. That's why I love engineers. They always do these things. it's
I think it's part of it is engineering, and part of it is because I grew up poor, so I'm like extremely risk adverse. So like my first thought for anything that happens is like, what's the worst thing could happen? How many backup plans do we have? Do we have plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Like that's just kind of how my brain works, right? Because when you grow up in poverty, it's like scarcity. The scarcity mindset is the thing that you have, that you're like, no, everything is not going to be okay. What are we going to, even if it's okay, I'd rather have these fail-safe plans there so that if I don't use it, that's great. But if I use it, I'm not going to lose any sleep at night. Right. So it's engineering plus growing up poor seems to give us these like multiple backup plans so that we don't fail.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Kristy, you said you were 7, right? When you came to Canada?
7, turning 8 around that.
Okay, so like grade 2 or something like that, right? Or 2 or 3 or something?
Grade 1, grade 2.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I came from Poland actually. When I was in grade 1 as well, we came to Canada, and we were escaping. It was communist at the time, so we were escaping communism. So we had like a pretty crazy story too, where it's like, new country, escaping communism, obviously poor, right? It's not like you come to Canada and then parents are earning 6 figures or anything like that, right? So I hear you when you talk about, the kind of scarcity mindset and having these backup plans. I hear you, because I feel I have that too, just from that kind of experience. And it drives my wife crazy sometimes, but it's good to have it's good to have both bases covered, right?
That's fascinating. Does your parents also think if the commies are not breaking down your door and then dragging you off to a labor camp, you don't have real problems?
There's definitely a different perspective, right? Where
definitely have a very different perspective. The kind of like trauma that our parents lived through, we can't even imagine. Like we would never be able to imagine in a million years.
100%. Like I just, sometimes you hear people complain, and it's like, we have no right to complain. I've lost my right to complain because I don't have to worry for my life. So
and it's been quite fascinating, like getting to know my parents' background, because one of the things we did while traveling through Europe was visiting Eastern Europe and seeing all the damage that was caused by communism, and all the things, like all the people that suffered. And like there was this one story I remember of this in the museum in Estonia. There was this one like little tiny sack of sand, and it was saying that this sand was like a possession kept by a woman who was basically dragged off to Siberia, like by the Russians. And she was like grasping on this bag of sand. When the soldiers tried to take it away from her, she was like, no, you can shoot me, but I'm not going to let you take this sand, because this is the sand from Estonia, from my country, that you're trying to like drag me away from. Right. And it just really shows like the humanity, like how much humanity was taken away from those people. And it really makes you like appreciate everything you have, that you've never had to go through, famine. You never had to go through revolution or war. It really makes you appreciate everything that you have.
Is your wife, what background is she from?
So she's Dutch and English.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, actually. There is something that I've been noticing, the more interviews and the more FI couples that I do, there's one person that grew up in relative poverty or had some experience with poverty, and another person who didn't. And there is this weird interplay of like, when you put the two kind of skill sets together, that's kind of what creates the FI mindset. Because
interesting.
I was actually born in Canada, so I didn't get any of your stuff. Kristy, and as a result of that, Kristy is the one that budgets. Like she budgets like crazy. She's the one obsessing over spreadsheets. She, like when you walk into a store, I don't know how much grapes are supposed to cost, but she will remember, oh, that's too expensive. Grapes should cost this much per pound or something like that. So her mind is a steel trap for prices. And as a result of that, she's amazing at budgeting and getting the maximum value out of your money, because she grew up in an environment where she didn't have a lot of that. I, on the other hand, didn't have that, but as a result of that, it's kind of a double-edged sword. When you grow up in poverty, investing in something that could potentially go down in value is really, really, really difficult. Like putting your money in anything besides
Savings account?
A savings account or your mattress is extremely difficult for someone who grew up in poverty, but it's not for me. So for me, like I was able to more objectively look at all the math and figure out how, the stock market is volatile, but in the longer term, it's the best way of growing your wealth. So putting together those two skill sets, the ability to save money and the ability to and the ability to figure out how to invest it intelligently. Those are the two skill sets that you actually need to become FI, and it comes from having, I think one person who grew up in poverty and one person who grew up middle class.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that way you kind of get the basis covered. I find it's usually like I'm the analytical one for us and coming up with the contingency plans and the redundancies and all that. Whereas my wife, she's like the trigger puller, right? She'll be the one that's like, okay, you actually have to do it now instead of just hiding behind your spreadsheet and reanalyzing it for the 30th time.
Oh, yeah. And you need that. You absolutely need that, right? Because if it wasn't him, I probably would have been like, no, I can't jump. I can't do this. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, you need somebody who's optimistic that's like, it's going to be okay, right? You're wasting your life not taking this chance. Like
exactly.
You're dead, right? So yeah, you need that person to pull you out of it.
Like you, Kristy, is extremely vulnerable to analysis paralysis.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, me too. I hear you. I'm sure Kristy and I could geek out on spreadsheets for hours.
Yeah. Totally. I love the spreadsheet. Oh yeah, totally. All spreadsheeting all the time. That's what we're going to be doing next time we see each other. For sure.
That's awesome. No, that's great. Yeah, that's really fascinating how the like with the couples though. That's really interesting. But yeah, so we talked a little bit. We mentioned kind of casually the some of the calculators that we use, that both you guys use, I use. I remember you guys talking about how you used FireCalc or was CFire Sim. Those are kind of the two that I'm aware of. And I remember using them obsessively before handing in my resignation. I remember waking up at like 3 a.m. on the day I was about to hand it in, and I'm re-crunching the numbers on I'm rerunning the simulations, like 3 a.m. before, because I knew like, okay, in like 8 hours you're going to be handing in a resignation. Are you sure? So let's talk about these. Can you explain to the listeners, what those are and how you use them?
Well, so these are both just 3 tools that someone made that allows you to dynamically run the Trinity study again in like a second or two. So how it works is you put in your a certain portfolio size, how much you plan on spending, and the amount of time that you're planning on retiring, as well as a bunch of other variables if you want. And behind the scenes, they pulled all of the stock market and all of the pricing data for the stock market and the bond market across all of the historical data that you can have going back to, I don't know how long, like 200 years or whatever. And they will then rerun the simulation for you, the same one that the 4% study does, and it will tell you how many, what your success rate is. So what the FireSim spits out is not how much money you end up with, because that really depends on when you retired and the sequence of returns that happen. But it returns back a success rate. So did you make it to the end of the retirement without running out of money? So if you were to go into it and you would plug in $1 million and 40,000 spending, which is 4%, you would get 95% a success rate. That's what they did. But that allows you to kind of play around and do what if analysis. You can kind of go, what if I work a little bit longer and I save out 1.1 million or something like that? Then your success rate will be like 96% or 97% or something like that. At a certain point, it does become like 100%, which is there is no recorded failure in history, and that's somewhere around 3.5 or something like that. So that's also for the people out there that just really absolutely have to get over that hump of like 100%. You can figure out where that point is. You can also do it, and you can also do it like what we discovered, which is, hey, you can do it by adjusting your spending too. If you spend a little bit more time in Thailand, we can drop our spending from 40,000 to maybe 35,000, 30,000. What does that do to your retirement? And then you'll be able to measure quantitatively how that decision affects the safety of your retirement period. So it's a free tool that's used out there, and it's everybody who attempts to do this thing spends a lot of time on those calculators. I'm not sure why they didn't put advertising on those calculators, but if they did, somebody would be making a lot of money right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, and yeah, it's interesting you bring up the 3.5%. I remember I was listening to a podcast where Michael Kitces was on it, on the Mad Scientist podcast, and he dived into this pretty deeply, and he kind of mentioned how the 3.5% is sort of that floor, that like very sustainable floor that's pretty good for early retirees that are looking to make it last, let's say 60 years or something like that. So that's why I think that's a really good episode. So I'll link to all those tools, and I'll link to that episode as well. I think it's very valuable to listen to. So I'll do that in the show notes. Now, in those tools, you can kind of go with the default settings, or you can adjust certain variables as well. Are there any adjustments that you made or wish you'd made that you think would be useful for Canadians to know when they run their own calculations and simulations before they pull the trigger and see whether they can retire yet or not?
Yeah, you know what? Actually, in many ways, it's kind of funny because there's a lot of people out there that obsess over the 4% rule. If you look at the 4% rule, the media is like, but with Trump and low returns and all this kind of stuff, it's not the 4% rule, it's 3% rule, maybe it's 3.5, maybe it's 3.75. The really interesting thing is that you can actually dance out a lot of those like bad situations using simply just your decisions after you're retired, like lifestyle. So I've talked about a little bit about using geographic arbitrage to dynamically adjust your spending after you retire. I don't think anyone else has written about this because we're one of the few people who actually implemented it in practice. Another that I was really surprised about was inflation. So if you remember back then when I was describing the 4% rule, one of the things that they said was withdraw 40,000 and adjust it for inflation. And what was really interesting to me when we were retiring, after we retired, is we realized that if you travel and you decide to retire to another country, inflation numbers that we're used to back in Canada or the US every inflation number is national, right? Because when you report the CPI when the Bank of Canada reports the CPI top line inflation rate every year, that's for inflation inside Canada. When the US does it, that's for inflation inside the US. Inflation actually changes depending on what country that you're in. And Japan has famously been in a deflationary spiral for like decades, the last decade and all that kind of stuff. So people kind of think of inflation as something, and I thought this as well, that inflation was something that you couldn't change and simply just happened to you. But when you start traveling, you realize you're not exposed to the inflation of your home country. You're exposed to the inflation of the country that you're actually in. So we're in Thailand right now. We're talking in Thailand. 4 years ago, we were also in Thailand. And the funny thing is inflation seems to have not affected Thailand at all.
Yeah. So back then in 2016, we rented an apartment for, it was like 575 Canadian dollars. And now we can still rent an apartment for 575 Canadian dollars in Bangkok. And we also found that food, like back then we bought a bowl of noodles for like 40 baht, which is like less than $2 Canadian. Now it's still 40 baht. And it's not just Thailand either. Like when we were traveling around Europe, because we actually spent a year in Europe last year, because we actually got a visa that allowed us to stay there. And we found out that places like Portugal or your favorite, Poland, actually has really like almost negative inflation or no inflation at all, where you go in and the cost of living is so much lower than what we're used to, which is living in Toronto, or even a lot of our friends living in other cities in Canada. And then I even talk to my friends and comparing Toronto with other cities, like people who live in smaller towns or people who live in like the Maritimes or people who live in Montreal, their cost of living is lower too. So that the fact that you have to spend a certain amount and you are subjected to inflation, that happens when you are forced to stay in a big city because of work. If you have the ability to actually move around, like we've seen this with one of our readers, they used to live in really, really expensive San Francisco, but because one of them, their job was actually completely online, they work from home, and they actually moved to Mexico and the time zone didn't change. Their employer didn't even care because it's basically the same thing. She showed up to work, did her work at the same time online, and they were able to cut their expenses in half. So it really makes a huge difference where you are, and a lot of it is tied to work. A lot of people have high cost of living because of the city that they work in. They're tied to big cities.
Yeah. So I mean, so going back to the calculator, the parameters. Well, the parameter by default assumes that you are adjusting for inflation based on the CPI numbers. And I didn't realize this, but you can actually change that. If you drop it to like 0, like 4% becomes like just based on that, if you don't need to worry about inflation, the 4% rule becomes like 100% success rate. And you know what? In practice, we've been retired for 4 years now. We should have been taking inflation adjustments this entire time, and in actuality,
it's like deflation.
It's actually been going down. It's been going down, and we've been actually seeing deflationary spending. And that was an assumption that I never even thought to put.
Yeah, we were actually supposed to raise the 40,000 by 2% each year because 4% allows you to actually raise it by that. But we haven't had to. Like we're still within 40,000. Last year I only spent 36,000 because we spent a lot of time in Mexico where everything was dirt cheap. So it's not as fixed as you think it is. A lot of it is because people are tied to their jobs. So they are kind of forced to stay in that area and they don't have the time. They don't have the ability to mitigate it. Another thing we realized after retirement, and of course the retirement police are going to be all up in arms on this, is that like even if you make a tiny bit of money, like one of the things we were trying to do, because one of my passions is writing, so we were trying to write children's books while we were working. I thought that was going to be my like freedom, my like path to riches. Yeah, don't try to write a children's book; it's not going to be your path to riches. Trust me. Doing that, like that. Even now, like after we published a children's book with Scholastic, it's not enough to even pay for groceries. But even making as little as like 5,000 after retirement, like that would be a huge failure if you did that regularly, right? Like if I made $5,000 a year, I can't cover any of my grocery costs. That's not even that. My grocery costs are going to swamp that, right? But if you look at the 4% rule and you're thinking, okay, maybe I'll be safer with 3.5%. Boom, $5,000 from your children's book. All of a sudden, you only need to take out 3.5%. Right. So even if you make a tiny bit of money in retirement, it makes you safer. So you could either use geographic arbitrage to like mitigate your expenses because you're not stuck in a high cost city because you don't have to work anymore, or you could do something that you're passionate about. And even if it makes a little tiny bit of money, it makes it so much safer. And normally that would be a abject failure if you made 5,000 a year. But after you become FI, it helps tremendously because it makes a really big difference in your withdrawal rate.
For sure. Yeah. To me, that was kind of one of my big sort of revelations. I don't know if that's the right word, but my big sort of light bulb moments was when you realize that realistically, you actually are going to make some income in retirement. That it's actually, I would argue, it's unrealistic to assume that you're not going to make any income, that others would consider as working, because you're probably going to you're going to be doing things you're passionate about anyway, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to then take that thing you love doing anyway, that you would probably be doing for free anyway, and just doing a small little tweak and actually making some income out of it. So to me, that was the biggest thing. And I've noticed, I think this is a common, tell me what you think of this, but from what I've seen, because I study a lot of the other early retirees as well, that are kind of in the FIRE movement, and it seems like this is a common mistake that we all have made, where whenever we, went into FIRE Calc and we did our simulations, we all assumed that we were going to retire and not ever generate any income at all, through quote unquote working. But really everyone, at least everyone that I've seen, including myself, still brings in some sort of income, because, you know what I mean? Like, what have you found in that kind of situation?
Yeah, so this is actually, I've definitely heard of this. And one of the things that the retirement police like to criticize on is, but all these retirees are, writing blogs or doing something on the side. And that's what they're living off of. They're not living off of their portfolio at all, right? So who cares what the retirement police think, right? But I think they have, a point on that. So one of the things we've actually done to really test out our portfolio is we've actually split it into two portfolios, which is the money that we retired with, that was part of our FI number, and then a separate portfolio of income coming in afterwards, right? And we only use that income for business expenses, like we need to buy a new laptop or, for the server, because our blog is getting pretty big now, so it's costing more money than we thought initially, right? So then, but it's still working. Like we are still living off the original money that we retired in, and it's just fine. And again, and based on what you're saying, we're also making money in retirement, along with other retirees who are following their passion, right? So it's absolutely, I just don't believe that people are not going to make a single cent after they retire. Like a lot of these are very driven, successful people. Like how were they even able to get to FI if they just sit on the beach for the next 50 years? Like,
right.
That's just unlikely. But if you choose not to make money, it still works. You can still live off the original portfolio based on the 3.5% or 4%, but very unlikely that people are just not going to make any money for the next 50 years.
For sure. And then Bryce was talking about with the 4% rule, and then how the sort of the inverse of that is the 25, right? So you can multiply by 25 to sort of get to get your number that way. So what I like to, I know I was doing this analysis myself before kind of pulling the trigger and handing in the resignation, but it's like if you, like you mentioned the $5,000 a year example, if you made an extra $5,000 a year, if you multiply that by 25, that's 125,000, right? So by just saying, hey, I'm going to make an extra 5K a year when I'm retired, that now you don't have to have an extra $125,000 in your portfolio. I mean, that's huge, right? I mean, the amount of work that requires to get 125K is a lot. And so just by making that one tweak, it's huge.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, there are some careers in which it's really easy to exactly choose how many hours you want to work or something like that.
Right.
With engineering, you have to go and find freelance projects and this kind of stuff. But if you're like a nurse or a pharmacist, and you just be like, okay, well, I'll just pick up I'll just go from full time to like doing a shift a month or something like that. It becomes really easy to actually like control exactly how much part-time income you're willing to work. And a lot of those professions need a certain number of hours just to maintain their license or whatever, right? So for those professions, it's actually a lot easier than you think it is, because just in the process of maintaining the hours needed to keep their license, they've actually unwittingly stripped out like hundreds of thousands of dollars out of their FI portfolio. And when I tell them that, they kind of go, "Oh, really?" Right? Like their eyes just light up and kind of go, "Wow, I had no idea." It's really amazing how many knobs you can turn once you kind of understand how the math works.
For sure. And I mean, I just quickly threw in a spreadsheet. I mean, if you have, let's say you're making 10,000 a year, which is totally reasonable, right? I mean, it's fine, right? You multiply that by 25, that's $250,000, $250,000 that now you need less in your portfolio, for example, right? I mean, that's, I don't know, to me, that was kind of a bit of a game, or at least that part helped me sleep better at night, that if markets really just go bananas and things really go bad, or I don't know, or we have some unexpected expense that I didn't foresee or something like that, it's like, okay, dude, just fine and go and make an extra 10K a year, and then stop stressing out. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. There's like so many levers to pull, right? Like the thing is, before you retire, you're just looking at your spreadsheets and going like, what about this? This could go wrong. That could go wrong. This could go wrong.
Yeah.
But then after you're actually out and you actually are doing it, you're like, oh my God, there's so many things that could go right. Like I could do geographic arbitrage. I have a cash cushion. I could live off my yield. I could make a little bit of money afterwards. There's just a lot of things, a lot of options that are open to you. And I think one of the reasons why you can think about that more after you leave work is because your brain has the space to actually think about solutions rather than worrying about everything that can go wrong.
Yeah. I don't know, but did you guys get a giant creativity burst when you resigned?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Part of it is from traveling, because we met so many different people, like the World Schoolers thing, which is something we discovered while traveling. We can talk about that in a little bit, but just different people from different backgrounds that I would have never come across when I was working, because I was just around IT people all the time. I didn't meet anybody else from any other background. Gave us so many ideas that we would have never come up with. Different places, we learned about the history, the culture, the different ways people do things. Never would have, come across that while we were working. Different opportunities has come to us, like talking, public speaking, being part of different communities that we didn't know existed. Yeah, just getting out of that mindset. Because I actually talked to my doctor about this before, and she said that a lot of the cases that come to her now for, to be medicated because of stress, it used to be before that she would get, 80% of the people were due to cancer or some sort of like genetic disease that they had no control over. Now, 80% of the people coming to her is because of stress related, because of work related issues, because she describes it as everybody's stuck in this lizard brain mentality, in that they're kind of thinking about survival and they can't actually access the creative part of their brain because the lizard brain keeps taking over and thinking about everything that could go wrong. So there's like actual tangible evidence from doctors that's saying, because of all the hours that we're working and the amount of stress that we've had to put on ourselves, we have not been able to even tap into that creative part of our brain. Like our creativity exploded for writing after we left, because there's so many opportunities and so many different people and so many experiences that we never had. that generated all these different ideas for solving problems.
Yeah. That's really fascinating that you guys had that experience as well, because I definitely felt this giant creativity boost as well once I pulled the trigger on it, and then that kind of made me feel a bit even safer too, thinking, okay, well, you're already, because like I'm a business guy, that's been my whole kind of background, right? So for me, it's like, oh, business idea, this fun like project business idea, this would be fun to try, and then you kind of think about it like, wow, this is, I don't know, it's almost like a part of your brain has been unclogged, and now like your creativity is just kind of, you're able to access that kind of part of your brain that was locked off before. And then also a lot of those things you could easily monetize if needed, so that also I think helps with the whole sleeping at night if there's another 2008 or something like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
People don't realize how many different levers they can pull after retirement, right? Because you actually have time to do all those things.
Right.
It's really hard to think about, I'm going to do a side hustle while I'm working because I'm already exhausted. I've worked like 14 hours, right? But then afterwards, you're like, wow, I have the entire day. I could start, 10 different projects right now if I wanted, and then you go and do it.
That's right. It's like, are you telling me if you're not going to work, you can't do something that generates some income for 2 hours a day that you actually enjoy? And I don't know, like things like that, right? It's fascinating.
Oh yeah. And just the creative ways people have thought about, like I know one of my blogger friends, he writes about how he generates passive income. Like he's done stuff like pick up stuff from the trash and then just sell it online. Like there's perfectly good furniture that people just throw out and then you list it online and people will buy it for $60, $100. It's just, you don't even need any skills. You just need time. That's it, right?
Yeah. I have one friend who's really into woodworking, for example, right? And it's like, okay, well, if you're going to do that, eventually you're going to have all this stuff that you can't possibly fit in your house because you keep building things because it's fun for you. Well, you could sell some of that, right? And there you go. And I mean, you're going to be doing woodworking anyway because you love it. So, but you're going to run out of storage eventually. So sell that stuff. And what you're telling me, you can't make a few grand, selling some nice custom work that you did. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be that much because you're actually using it to subsidize your passive income, right? You're not using it to cover everything. So the pressure is off, right? Yeah.
And that's a great strategy. Sell stuff to homeowners. Those guys will buy anything.
Bryce is stirring the pot, making this controversial.
Oh yeah, sure.
But
you're so innocent, right? You're so innocent like a lamb.
That's awesome. Okay, we talked about the yield shield a bit. Let's dive into that a little bit more. You guys do use what you call the yield shield. Can you explain what that is to everyone that hasn't been on your blog? I'll link to it anyway in the show notes so everyone can read upon it. You guys do a lot of great detail on it, but maybe just to give us a bit of a high level overview what it is.
So the yield shield is a name that we came up with to kind of make your portfolio a little bit more insulated from the sequence of return risk. So again, to recap, what you absolutely don't, when markets plop, the best thing to do is buy. The okay thing to do is hold, and the worst thing to do is sell. So what you want to do is prevent yourself from selling. So when we retired, we shifted our portfolio a little bit away from a traditional indexing portfolio and then towards assets that yield a little bit more money. So when we say yield, it's a combination of bonds, which pay interest every month, as well as stocks, which pay dividends every month. So we ended up using assets like preferred shares, REITs,
corporate
bonds, dividend-paying stocks, and we use these assets because they are generally kind of correlated to assets that we already own, but also pay a little bit more yield. So they may return a little bit less, but they pay more consistent income. So by doing that, and we talked a lot more detail on this in our blog, we were able to bring the yield on our portfolio, which is the amount of cash that the portfolio generates every year, without selling anything, from about 2.5% to about 3.5%. So as a result of that, a lot more of our living expenses can come from assets a lot more of our living expenses can simply come from cash that gets generated automatically in the portfolio without having to sell anything. Because when you sell something when it's down, that's when you run into trouble. But if you just leave it, it will eventually come back up. So once you are able to raise what I call the yield shield, and in combination with your cash cushion, which is the amount of cash you leave outside your portfolio to make up any shortfall, you can actually survive many, many years of continuous down markets without having to sell anything. And in essence, hunker down and wait for markets to turn back up again. So that's kind of the idea of the strategy that we use.
Yeah, let me just add to that. So the portfolio that we have is 60-40, 60 equity and then 40 fixed income. So the 60 equity part, we're actually leaving that because that hedges for inflation. And then the 40 fixed income part, we're replacing that with higher yielding assets so that we don't actually have to sell. So that will actually create a portfolio that is more volatile than just a 60 equity and then 40 bond portfolio, but it does give us the ability to have a higher yield without forcing us to sell anything during a down market, because that's like the worst possible thing you can do.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And the and just to clarify, this yield shield strategy that we're using is not meant to be something that you hold long term. We're only going to be using higher yielding assets like preferred shares and stuff for the first 3 to 5 years of our retirement. We've been into 4 now, so we're already starting looking to kind of bringing it down and then moving back into a more traditional index portfolio, because the 4% rule was based off of simulations of an index portfolio. So we are deviating a little bit from the simulation to try to mitigate the risk of being part of the 5% that fail. But longer term, we're going to come back into the fold of a more traditional index portfolio once we have pulled out of the danger zone of being of the first 3 to 5 years of retirement.
Gotcha. And then I got the impression that a lot of the others in the FIRE community, so in the financial independence, retire early community, who have actually pulled off an early retirement, that they don't focus on the yield the way that you guys do. So, I mean, the most common strategy, at least from what I've seen, seems to be to not focus all that much on the yield and instead just to withdraw that 3.5 to 4% of their portfolio per year by selling off investments when needed, even if it is a down market, and that's kind of what the Trinity study, it proved that is actually still sustainable. So what made you guys decide to create this yield shield strategy instead of just going for the simpler 3.5 to 4% withdrawal rate and just not worrying about the yield? Because this is obviously, more work. You're holding different sort of assets. They have their own risk on top of it, right? So what was your reasoning there?
Well, I mean, I can't just say don't worry about it, because Kristy's going to constantly worry about it. If it's going to go down and I have to sell, and I can't just well, I might be able to say, look at the spreadsheet. It's statistically
I would just
fine.
yell sequence of return risk very, very loud.
So I needed something. I needed something a little bit safer, because we know from how indexing works. If you never sell during a downturn, the index always recovers. So. So this was our way of kind of making the 95% success rate a little bit more tilted in our favor. But that's we wanted to make it safer.
Yeah, I think it's actually helped a lot in alleviating the stress. Because the thing is, people say, oh yeah, I'm going to be totally fine when the stock market goes down. I'm not going to sell. The thing is, you actually have to live through it to know that you're not going to be able to sell it, right? So a lot of it is actually mental. It's a lot of emotional, trying to actually hold on to your emotions and not let it run away from you. So I think that by doing this, it actually has helped us a lot, because we've actually tested it in 2015. And then again, last year when it plummeted, because it really does help you sleep at night when you realize that the yield is covering your expenses and that you don't have to kind of, have that mental breakdown of, oh my God, I'm selling during a downturn. And it's the first 5 years of retirement. What if it doesn't work out? It really gives you that peace of mind. Another thing is, this is what I realized. After you retired, you don't actually realize how useful geographic arbitrage is until you actually get out there and try it, right? Because I had read books from other travelers saying oh yeah, traveling is less expensive than staying home. But I was like, that's theoretical, right? So a lot of it is in the beginning. It is very, very important to have that mindset, to have that peace of mind and not sell. And it's for everyone that says, oh, I'm going to be totally fine selling into a downturn. Try it and see. It really makes a huge difference. And the first 5 years is key. So for us, in order to prevent us from doing something like that, and in order to give us enough time to be comfortable with retirement and testing it out, that has actually proven to be very valuable for us to not sell anything during 2015 and last year when the stock market plummeted.
Yeah, I know a lot of those other bloggers, and knowing their personality, they are far more comfortable with risk than she is.
To give you an example, I emailed Pete before we retired to Money Mustache, Mr. Money Mustache. He's one of the biggest bloggers within the FIRE space, to ask him, can you look at my numbers? Do you think it's okay for us to retire? And he's like, yeah, you guys are good to go. And then I immediately had a panic attack after I gave my notice. So clearly I was not okay. So I sent him another follow-up panic email saying like, oh my God, I'm having a panic attack. Did you ever have to go through this? And he's like, nah. So like it really, I think part of it is because my background as well, right? So it really varies from person to person. So you really have to know yourself, and just looking at other people and saying, oh, they're fine. They're not selling anything. I'm going to be just like that. You really have to live through it to actually know what it's like. I didn't know I was going to have a panic attack after I gave my notice, but it happened. It was totally fine 2 days later. But at the time, if you compare that to having a drop in the market during your first 5 years, during the sequence of return risk, and you have a panic attack and you hit the sell button, you're screwed, right? Mm-hmm. That was just me, calming myself because I had already given my notice. But if we didn't actually have the yield to live off and I actually sold, that would have been horrible.
Right. Because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Pete, so Mr. Money Master and Jim Collins as well, those are the kind of the people I was thinking about when I asked that question, where they don't really talk about yield much at all. They just say, look, this 3.54% rule, it's a sustainable thing. And so you just sell that amount, even in the downturns, and you mathematically, historically, you would still be okay. I mean, is that, would you say that's kind of the way that they approach it, or do you think I'm misinterpreting?
Yes, they have far more faith in the statistics than Kristy does.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Understood. So okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
No, sorry, Kristy, what did you say? I cut you off there a bit.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying that, so it really varies from person to person. And there are some people that are cowboys and they can go like 100% equities or 90% equities. And they're just, it's fine. I don't worry about it and it's going to be fine. I am not one of those people. I need to have backup plan after backup plan after backup plan. And I need to actually be assured. So I think everybody needs to know what, kind of know themselves and know their mindset. And just because somebody else is more risk taking than you doesn't mean that you should be doing the same thing, right? So understood. I find that absolutely that is very valid for people to follow what the more risk adverse bloggers are doing, but you really have to know yourself.
Understood. That makes total sense. Yeah, if it's because I was approaching it purely from a mathematical standpoint, but you bring up a great point how there's actually that whole psychological benefit. And are you freaking out when it drops 30% because we had, have another 2008 or whatever the case may be. So, so that's really, really interesting to kind of consider that component. Reminds me a bit of dividend investors, right? Because there's a lot of people who see themselves as dividend investors and they just want to have dividend. They just want to generate the dividends, buy these blue chip companies and live off the dividends, right? They're favorably taxed in Canada. There's arguments for doing so, but mathematically it's been proven that actually you're better off not doing that strategy and just going with like a broad market index, for example. And because you want to look at total return, not the yield. But then to your point, it's like, well, hold on, that's just, you're looking at the math side. There's also the whole psychological benefit where you want that cash, every quarter or whatever the case may be. So very interesting. That's
and again, we're only really doing this for like 3 to 5 years. So longer term, we get the benefits of like, total return versus dividend. But in that danger zone, I want that safety in the danger zone. Gotcha.
That makes total sense. Now, when you guys pick those different ETFs, like we'll talk about them in a sec, like the REITs, the preferred shares, the corporate bonds, the more dividend focused stocks, all those ETFs, did you guys, before picking them, did you look at, well, how did those guys perform in 2008? Did the income that they generated get cut? How much did they drop in value? What kind of analysis did you do when you sort of stress tested the strategy of yours?
Sure. I mean, like in Canada, preferred shares, corporate bonds, like none of those actually got cut because in Canada, even when 2008, our stock market was getting hammered, but because our banks weren't failing like they were for the Americans, none of our banks went bankrupt, obviously, and as a result, none of our preferreds actually got cut during that time. And I just checked that now with CPD right before the call. But so in picking those particular ETFs, we simply use the same approach that we did when picking equity ETFs, which is find me an index that covers this asset class and find the lowest cost ETF that covers that index. So those are the ones that we came up with. They're all run by iShares, which is a pretty good company, that an ETF company that runs both in Canada and the US. And that's kind of how we do it.
Gotcha. Okay. And then you guys did, so you did REITs, for example. What was your reasoning behind choosing REITs? And then you guys do 5% of your portfolio in that. What was your kind of thought process in incorporating those?
Well, REITs are actually a pretty good, like they kind of like act a little bit more like equities and bonds. So we swapped out a little bit of our TSX for allocation to buy REITs instead. And to people who don't know what a REIT is a REIT is a real estate investment trust. And what it does is it owns big office buildings, like the ones like the big, the big skyscrapers downtown. It owns Young and Dundas Center and Scotiabank Theatre and like all these buildings that are like all over Canada. And whatever rent that the companies inside pay to the building owner gets distributed to you as a distribution. So for that, we just use the same approach there. REITs are one of the a pretty safe income stream because when businesses fail, like their rent is the last thing that they attempt to cut. They'd rather lay off employees rather than stop paying the rent. So that was also another asset that we used. And in picking the ETF, it was the same approach. Just find the REIT index and find the lowest cost ETF that I could use to access that.
Gotcha. And then what about Canadian preferred shares? You guys have quite a bit in there on your site. You said you had about 20% weight in those. What was your kind of thought process? What made you comfortable doing preferred shares? Because if anyone that kind of Googles it, right, they're going to learn some negative things about preferred shares. How did you guys get comfortable with them to the point where you're willing to put 20% in?
Well, preferred shares as well as corporate bonds, they're just kind of going up the risk spectrum. So they are riskier forms of debt than rock solid Canada government, government or Canada bonds, and in more, and they are going to act more volatile than the Canadian government bonds, but as a result, they do pay more yield. So a government bond at the time that we were looking at was paying like 2.5%. A corporate bond would pay around 3%, and then a preferred share would pay around like 5%. But preferred shares, again, they didn't cut their dividends during 2008. 2008 being a once in a generation event, and if they survive that without cutting the dividends, I have a pretty good confidence that they're going to survive the next one.
Gotcha. And then the last one to talk about was the select dividends you guys picked. What was your reasoning behind that one? The Canadian select dividends.
Select dividend fund is kind of just a slice of the TSX, which is kind of the more stable blue chip companies that pay dividends. So think like BMO, TD, RBC, that kind of thing. So they're just so that wasn't even just another asset class. That was just concentrating a little bit more of the overall TSX, kind of near the top of the bigger, larger cap financial companies, because I wanted the yield a little bit. Interestingly enough, because they are because when you do that and you're picking the larger blue chip companies, they actually have a lower what's called a beta than the overall market, in that they actually tend to be less volatile than the overall market, because smaller cap companies tend to swing more in price than the larger cap companies like the TDs and the CIBCs that are in the TSX. So that had a weird effect of actually increasing my yield while decreasing my volatility. So
interesting. No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. There's a lot of out of all the fire bloggers, I find a lot of them don't really touch too much on things like REITs and preferred shares and select dividend ETFs, things like that. So I appreciate you taking the time to kind of take us through it a bit, and I can link to it on your the part on your blog too, because I know you did specific posts about each one of those actually. So I think for anybody that wants to get their feet wet with those, that's probably a really, really good place to start. So no, that's awesome. Thank you. And then we talked about this a bit, but how did you guys change your portfolio from pre-retirement to retirement, if at all?
Funnily enough, so what you're supposed to do if you're really far away from retirement, by that I mean like 10, 15 years, you're supposed to go, 90-10 equity, 90 equity, 10 fixed income. And then you're supposed to shift closer and closer to say 60-40, a more balanced portfolio as you get closer and closer to retirement. When we even started doing this, we were already 3 years away from retirement. So we started with 60-40 and then just kind of stayed there. So after closer as we got to retirement, we shifted into these kinds of higher yielding assets to boost my yield a little bit before I actually hit the ground running. And now that we've been retired for a few years, we're actually planning on moving back to a more traditional 60-40 portfolio. And but yeah, that's the only major change that's the only major change that we did. And arguably, you don't even have to do that. You could, if you're comfortable relying on that math and just letting yourself sell into a down market with the faith that it'll come back up statistically. You don't even have to do that. You can stick with bare index if you want. But that's what we did.
I think what you could do is stick with the indexing model that other people are doing, but then also have a cash cushion in the beginning. So that, but you need a bigger cash cushion in that case, right? So if you're willing to work a bit longer and make a bigger cash cushion for, let's say 3 years or 5 years during the first the sequence of return risk, then you could do that as well.
That's a good point. The whether you do what we why we did the yield shield also was that it also allows you to reduce the amount of cash cushion that you maintain outside the portfolio. So if you have $1 million portfolio and your yield is 2%, which is what you'll get with the TSX and the S&P 500 and bonds right now, and you spend $40,000, your yield is $220,000, but your income needs are $40,000. So if you want to have a cash cushion, you need to have a cash cushion. 1 year's worth of cash cushion is equal to $20,000. So if you want to have a cash cushion worth 3 years, you're going to need to save up $60,000 in a savings account outside of the portfolio before you retire. That could take a while. But if you do this yield shield stuff, the cash cushion needs drop significantly. So if you did what we did and brought your yield up to 3.5%, now your yield is now $35,000, but your spending is $40,000. So your cash cushion for each year is only $5,000. So in order to maintain the same amount of time in your cash cushion, which is 3 years, you only need $15,000 versus $60,000. And that could be, and if you're, I know that when you're getting really close to retirement, you're really itching to pull that trigger. And the idea of working one more year is probably not that appealing to you. So that's one way of getting out of it, of saying, oh, I don't have to work that much longer, just a few months, and then I'm good versus another year or whatever.
That's awesome. I'm glad you guys mentioned that because like you were talking about before, there's different levers you can pull in all of this whole FIRE thing. And so fires you can pull in retirement, levers you can pull after you're retired, levers you can pull before you retire. Like in your case, okay, maybe you don't want to work an extra year. So let's tweak our portfolio so that it's a bit more pro yield. And then that way we don't have to, that way you can escape the cubicle just a bit earlier, which is good for the mental health.
You can understand.
Yeah, what I found is the last year before you retire is really hard. Yeah. So like he was basically like, we have this app that we kind of like meet each other for lunch, so I know where he is. And I was just checking to see where he was, and I'm like, dude, you're walking around in a park. Get back to work. like several times, right? I'm like, there's still a year left. Get back to work. What the heck are you doing?
Yeah, that's pretty tough.
Yeah, it's very, very hard last year trying to like ride that final year out.
Yeah. Do you find isn't it interesting too, where you walk around the office and then you see some people that are like trying so hard to get promoted, trying so hard to climb the ladder, and like they're there before you come into work. They're there when you leave, and it's just so nice not to have to care about that anymore. I find it's such a nice feeling. Because I remember being that person, straight out of university, right? Like you get your nice like job, and then you just want to climb the ladder and see how much money you can make. And it's just so nice to be able to say, I don't have to worry about that treadmill anymore.
Absolutely. One of the other things I find is that it helps you act more like a human being. Because one of the things I was facing at my work was a lot of layoffs and a lot of the work being outsourced, right? So you have people that are coming in and people worried about their jobs being outsourced. So there's a lot of infighting, right? And if you try to provide any information to the newcomers coming in, then you're a traitor. And then people start withholding information. And that's really bad for the company. That's really bad for the work that you're trying to do, right? So if you're actually FI, you can actually do the right thing, which is like, what is it that I'm trying to do? And what is like a decent human thing to do rather than, scream at other people and then have fights with them all day. Like, what is the point of that, right? So I think FI really helps you make decisions that go along your values rather than do it because you like sell out because you have to do it for money because you have no choice.
Right. Yeah, it sounds almost like instead of being in the survival mode where you're just like, I need that paycheck, I can't get fired, I can't get replaced, and being maybe forced to do the kind of the political maneuvering or whatever you want to call it, instead to say, let's actually do the human thing, because that's stressful too, right?
Yeah, I've seen like people throw other people under the bus because they want to get a promotion. And it's really disheartening because I'm like,
Yeah.
Is that what you want to be known for? Like, you want your gravestone to say, got a promotion by destroying like 100 people's lives. Like,
Right.
Why would you?
Right.
Right? What is the point?
For sure. And then, let's say, talking about kind of worst case scenarios before, let's say we did have like a 40% downturn or something, significant, like another 2008. What would you guys do in that situation? I've heard this answer before, and I love your answer, so I want everyone to hear it. But yeah, tell me what you would do.
Well, obviously we would execute on the yield shield plan, and as well as end up using our cash cushion. But at the end of the day, geo arbitrage is the answer. And we have a saying that we like to tell each other, which is, if shit hits the fan, we're going to Thailand, which means we're going to take a flight to Thailand, sit on a beach, and then just ignore the rest of it, and then just just live on half the amount of money that we would live on while being on a beach and away from the Canadian winter. So that's my worst case scenario is sitting on a beach drinking Mai Tai. So not a bad life, huh?
For sure. That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. And then, I'm guessing you guys wouldn't really change your portfolio or anything like that during that time because you've already set up that yield shield there. You'll have that cash cushion as well. So you're basically just utilizing that without changing anything fundamental in your portfolio. Would that be accurate to say?
Oh yeah, that's actually the worst thing to do. To change to make a major change portfolio in the middle of a crash like that. No, you set up everything on autopilot, and then you go off to the beach.
Gotcha. And then one thing as well, I've heard some people kind of make this argument where, okay, well, if we did have another 2008, you can expect your yields to go down as well, right? Because companies are making less profits, they're issuing less dividends, for example. What if some of them started defaulting, things of that nature? So maybe now some of your bonds are taking a hit too. How do you deal with that objection or concern?
Well, if bonds start defaulting or preferred shares are defaulting, the stock market is also plummeting as well. So hiding in the stock market doesn't really help either. But even if yield starts plummeting or yield starts getting hit, we still have the cash cushion. That's our second backup plan, and we still have the ability to use geographic arbitrage.
Right.
So that's our third backup plan. So there's always something that you can do to make the numbers work, and all you have to do is just minimize or ideally eliminate selling anything and just wait, because that approach worked in 2008. If you just ignored the noise and you waited, it all came back up and then it all went higher. So as long as you can avoid selling during that time, and whatever it takes, either taking cash from your cash cushion or just sitting on a beach in Thailand or Vietnam or whatever, that's what you do. And then eventually you just wait until it comes back up and then you win.
Yeah. So this is why we like to have that 3-prong approach,
right?
Backup. Right? Backup A, B, C. So if first we rely on the yield, right? And if the yield gets cut, then we have the cash cushion. And if we deplete the cash cushion, then we're moving to Thailand, right? Or we can go to Portugal, or we can go to Mexico. There's many, many places in which the cost of living is just a fraction of how much it costs to live in North America. And then for other people, maybe they have side income, right? They have side gigs, and that could be like their fourth lever. So the key is to not just throw up your hands and say, I don't know what to do. I just never quit my job. Guess what? 2008, you're not going to have a job. So that's not really something that people should really rely on. I'd much rather be financially independent and have 3 or 4 different backup plans when shit hits the fan than sitting at my cubicle, like praying to God that I don't get let go.
Right. Yeah, because actually the working isn't actually a safe route either, because that's when people get fired as well, right? So yeah,
I've seen my coworkers get laid off for no reason other than the fact that, you know what, they're not meeting the targets this year. That's it. The company is still making money. They're just not making the targets. So somebody's got to go, right? Yeah. And if you didn't save enough money to become financially independent, you're screwed. So, people are way overestimating how secure a job is these days. Right? You can't just expect to work at the same company until you're 65 and for them to pay you a pension and you're done with life. That's the reality has changed, and we don't have that security anymore.
For sure. No, 100%. And I would say too, even if you are hitting your targets or your objectives or whatever, you could still get fired. I remember when I was a kid early career person, I thought, well, as long as I do a great job, I'm going to have a job, no problem. Yeah. There's no way I could get fired as long as I'm, doing everything my boss is asking me, etc. And then I remember it was my first job out of university, and this was like around 2008. and an entire floor of people at a company got fired. An entire floor got wiped out, right? And it's like, it's not that all of the whole floor was not hitting their targets or not hitting their objectives. It was just, look, basically, it was a company-owned internet, like from the US, and they said, you know what, we're going to switch our strategy. We're going to do something different now. I guess this thing wasn't making them enough money or whatever. And so they just cut the whole floor, right? And then, some people, so that kind of just to your point about the job thing isn't actually as safe as people think it is. Because even if you do everything right, you could still get fired.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your wife worked at BlackBerry, so she probably was.
Yes,
part of that.
exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, like people kind of,
through no fault of your own,
through no
right?
fault of their own.
100%. Yeah.
And people keep, there's this misconception that FIRE is this crazy kooky idea that's dangerous and it's only for people who are lazy and don't want to work. It's like, no. FIRE is the only way to make yourself safe from layoffs forever. Like the sooner you become this, when you start working, you become addicted. As soon, especially if you buy a house and you get a mortgage, you become addicted to that debt. You become addicted to that salary. And if someone takes that salary away from you at that point, oh boy, that does not feel good. But if you do the FIRE thing, you are kind of breaking the addiction from your salary, and nothing can ever hurt you. A layoff can never hurt you ever again. And so it's not even like a luxury, like crazy kooky idea, a risky thing that we're doing here. I'd say that FIRE is a far safer way of managing your finances than what most people do, which is just buy a house, go into a bunch of debt, and hope for the best.
Yeah, and one of the things I like to remind people, we write about this on the blog, we write about this on the book, is that the financial independence part of FIRE is mandatory and the retirement part is optional. If you like your job, no one is saying you have to quit your job. You can continue working, but having that peace of mind, that financial independence part, means that you are immune. You are invincible to layoffs. You don't have to worry about it if all of a sudden your work changes from something you love to something you hate. I've had that happen to me. You don't have to worry about it if, like you said, all of a sudden the company decides, you know what, the entire floor is gone. We're doing a different strategy now to that. Or they decide to outsource a whole bunch of people. Like none of those things are within your control. And then people are now talking about like, oh no, what if the robots are going to come to replace our jobs? If you are financially independent, you don't have to worry about that, right? So it really is about peace of mind and security. It's not about, oh, let's just all be lazy and not work anymore. It's a choice. It's totally up to you whether you want to keep working or not.
For sure. And guys, so your blog, Millennial Revolution, it's easily one of my favorite blogs. How is your book different than the blog? Where can everybody go to pick up your book, and where can we learn more from you guys?
Oh, thank you so much for the compliment. Okay, so the book has been written in a way that basically, because what happens when you read a blog is like, it's kind of like attending a fitness class. And then it's like every time you go in, it's a different session, and then you missed something from last class, or you don't really know where you are, right? So reading a blog is like all the materials everywhere. You have to like dig through it. Our book pulls everything together and ties it together in a story, and giving the lessons, like stories that we've never written on the blog, about how to actually see money and understand investing in a series of lessons that when you put together and you read the entire book, it gives you the entire picture of how to become financially independent.
Yeah, at this point on our blog, I think we have some like 500 articles.
Yeah, almost.
So somebody that's just coming in, it's going to take a long time for them to understand everything because the material was developed over a number of years. The book is kind of a one-stop shop, like condensed version of all that kind of stuff. With the book, and if you buy the book and you read that, that's all you need to do to learn everything that you need to know about FIRE, about how to implement it, and how to retire.
Yeah, we also have interviews with experts like Mr. Money Mustache and people from Go Curry Cracker, Justin, a whole bunch of other people, as well as leaders of the world traveling community. Because I talk about, world schoolers community, which I talk about briefly on the blog, but I don't actually dive into it because I haven't really interviewed any of them. So the book actually gives you a lot of resources on what you want to do. Because a lot of people ask me, like, what are you going to do when you have kids? Can you travel forever? This lifestyle is not sustainable. And so we do a lot of research into what if you have kids and how does that affect your finances and how does that affect this lifestyle going forward? So let's interview the experts and ask them.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on. This was so much fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us, and congrats on quitting and hitting your FI number.
Thanks so much, guys. All right, thanks for tuning into the show. Don't forget about the free giveaway for your chance to win a copy of Kristy's and Bryce's new book, Quit Like a Millionaire. You can sign up for the giveaway for free by going to buildwealthcanada.ca/giveaway. All one word. That's buildwealthcanada.ca/giveaway. Also, don't forget to get your free guide on the top ETFs in Canada, where I go into detail on what I invest in and why. And to get that, just sign up for a free savings account with the bank that I use, EQ Bank, where they have one of the highest interest rates that I've been able to find in Canada. It's an ongoing high interest rate. Sometimes it's even more than double what other banks are offering. Plus, you get free unlimited Interac e-transfers, which is super convenient for sending money. So to get the free guide, just sign up for EQ Savings Plus account using the link buildwealthcanada.ca/EQ. That's buildwealthcanada.ca/ the letter E and the letter Q. Then send me any confirmation email that you get from them to bonus@buildwealthcanada.ca, and I'll email you the full guide. All right. So thanks again for supporting the show in that way. Thank you for tuning in as well. Have a great week. I hope you're having a great summer, and talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Build Wealth Canada podcast at www.buildwealthcanada.ca.